What if you held a secret so far beyond the realm of ordinary understanding? A secret you deliberately buried, crafting a life where everything appeared as it should. But the truth remained hidden from the world. But what happens when that secret begins to unravel, piece by piece, and the carefully constructed life you've built starts to crack open? What would you do when the time comes to face your own past, to turn your life around with your own hands? The sleepy village of St. Mary awoke with a faint sigh, the quiet morning air filled with the promise of something unspoken, something hidden. The postman, his routine as predictable as the dawn, cycled past Miss Marple's cottage, the tires of his bicycle carving a familiar groove into the damp earth. The world around him was still, as if holding its breath, and yet beneath that stillness, there lingered a subtle tension, a sense of anticipation. It was the kind of morning that seemed devoid of purpose, one that whispered of forgotten truths only to those who had the patience to listen and the wisdom to understand. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with a steaming cup of tea, observed the postman as he moved with deliberate precision, his body stiff with age and years of habit. He dismounted from his bike, his movements slow but purposeful, and patted his coat pocket to ensure he still had his delivery list. There was a practiced flick of his wrist as he sorted through the letters, each one landing in the right spot with a well-practiced ease, until his hand hesitated. It lingered on a single envelope, a moment of indecision that seemed to stretch out far longer than it should have. Miss Marple watched carefully, her eyes narrowing as she sensed something amiss. He studied the letter for a beat too long, and then with a glance at the envelope, he slipped it carefully into the mailbox, as though the very paper demanded gentleness, as if it carried some unseen weight. Something about that small moment lingered in Miss Marple's mind, the oddness of it not easily shaken. She sipped her tea, deep in thought, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her cup. The rest of the morning passed in its usual tranquil rhythm until, shortly after her second cup of tea, a gentle tap echoed through her garden gate. Mrs. Weatherby, an elderly woman who lived a few houses down, stood there, her expression heavy with a quiet uncertainty, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle she feared she had no right to solve. In her hands she held a single letter, thin, cream-colored, and marked with an unusual elegance. Miss Marple regarded it for a long moment before taking it from her, her fingers curling around the paper as if it might crumble in her hands. The handwriting was an anachronism, slanted and firm, its strokes reminiscent of a different time, as though the author had been trained in an era where words were crafted with care. The name on the envelope made Miss Marple's heart skip a beat. Eliza Crane. The woman had died nearly 15 years ago, a quiet, solitary death. Few had mourned her passing, and fewer still had spoken of her since. Her life had been a mystery to many. Some said she had worked as a nurse in a grand house in Yorkshire, others whispered of a shameful dismissal. She had no known family, and no one had ever come forward to claim her. Yet here it was, a letter addressed to her, a woman who had long been buried beneath the weight of time and memory. Miss Marple turned the envelope over, examining the postmark. It was from Yorkshire, dated just 3 days prior, and the return address sent a ripple of recognition through her. Sir Miles Ravenon, an old name, a name that carried with it both prestige and shadows. He had been a man of wealth and industry, the last of a very old line known for its steel empire and elusive family affairs. His name had barely made the papers in the past years, except for the occasional mention in the society pages, often associated with scandal or mystery. The man had recently passed away, just the week before, and Miss Marple had read about it in the local paper. But why, she wondered? Would he be writing to a woman long dead? A woman buried in a forgotten grave in a village that had long moved on from her name? It was a question that gnawed at her, the answer elusive and troubling. Sir Miles was a man of structure, of reason. He didn't write letters out of sentiment, and if he had written to someone who had been dead for over a decade, it could only mean one thing, something unresolved, something that had not been laid to rest with Eliza Crane. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the letter, her mind working in the quiet silence of the room. Where did this come from? She asked, her voice calm but sharp, as if she already knew the answer, but needed to hear it from Mrs. Weatherby. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, her hand still holding the letter, her fingers trembling. "It was delivered this morning," she said softly. "It was in our box by mistake, though I suppose it hardly matters now." Her voice trailed off, unsure of whether she should even be speaking about it at all. Miss Marple looked at the envelope again, her brow furrowing as she traced the edges of the paper. Sir Miles had been a man of control, of legacy. He had not written to Eliza Crane without reason. No, this letter, this moment, was deliberate. The timing too was too precise. It had arrived now, after all these years, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to surface. Letters, Miss Marple thought, always have a sense of timing, a way of finding their way back to the people they need to reach, no matter how long it takes. "Perhaps it's not our place to open it," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "But the timing, it cannot be a coincidence. Letters like this are never accidental." Mrs. Weatherby shifted uneasily, her thoughts clearly echoing Miss Marple's own. "Do you think it could be about money? Some old debt or a secret?" Her voice was faint, a whisper of uncertainty hanging between them. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead she studied the letter once more, her thoughts clouded with the weight of the questions it raised. The postmark, the return address, the name of Sir Miles Ravenon, and the death of Eliza Crane. These were not ordinary circumstances. It was as though the letter had been waiting for the right moment to resurface, to reveal something hidden, something unresolved. She turned her gaze toward the window, where the morning light had softened into a hazy blur, casting a strange glow over the garden. "Secrets," she murmured, her voice low and steady, "have a way of reappearing when least expected. When they are most unwelcome." Mrs. Weatherby said nothing in reply. She too felt the weight of the words. She too knew that whatever lay within the envelope was bound to stir up more than just memories. It was a truth long buried, one that had waited in silence, and now it was demanding to be heard. Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, her knitting resting on her lap, when she felt a subtle shift in the air. It was a fleeting sensation, a whisper of something unspoken, but it was enough to make her set aside her work and prepare for what was about to unfold. The letter had come, bringing with it a trace of something strange, something that would soon stir the quiet streets of St. Mary Me. But as she sipped her tea, she had no idea that the real mystery was yet to reveal itself. Not long after, as Miss Marple glanced out of her window, her sharp eyes caught a strange scene unfolding outside the post office. A tall woman, her attire impeccable, exuding both elegance and a quiet urgency, stood speaking with Mr. Adams. The man's face, typically calm, betrayed discomfort as he tried to placate her. The woman's demeanor was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet determination that set her apart from the usual visitors to the village. Miss Marple, ever the observer, watched from behind the lace curtains, her eyes narrowing, as she noticed the woman's subtle but deliberate movements. There was something in the way she leaned in toward Mr. Adams, her eyes scanning the surroundings, not in the casual way most villagers would, but with an intensity that spoke of a deeper purpose. Then, as if by design, the woman pulled out a small folded card, tilting it just enough for Miss Marple to catch the name printed upon it, Eliza Crane. Her heart skipped a beat. The ghost of the past had just walked into St. Mary Me. As Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind whirred with possibilities. Who was this woman? And why had she come searching for Eliza Crane, a name that had not been spoken in years? A woman who had died under the most peculiar of circumstances nearly 15 years ago, with no relatives, no mourners, and no legacy to speak of. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple's mind turned over every detail, connecting dots that no one else might even notice. The stranger's arrival was certainly not a random event. St. Mary Me, though quiet, was not without its share of visitors. But this woman, tall, composed, and clearly from a world far beyond the village's humble borders, was different. When she arrived at the Elms, She made no grand gestures, no demands for attention. Instead, she quietly introduced herself as Margaret Crane, niece of the late Eliza Crane. She spoke of personal affairs, family matters left unresolved, keepsakes to be sorted. To most it would have seemed a simple, if curious, visit. But to Miss Marple, who knew how to read between the lines, it was far more than that. Margaret's questions were oddly specific. She didn't inquire about burial plots or property. Those were matters easily handled. Instead, she wanted to know if any of Eliza's belongings remained untouched, as though the physical remnants of a forgotten life could reveal secrets long buried. The village had forgotten Eliza Crane, but Margaret Crane had arrived to make sure those forgotten details would not remain hidden for long. Her composure was perfect, her mannerisms polished, but Miss Marple could see past the surface. There was no grief in Margaret's eyes, no nostalgia, only a quiet, deliberate resolve, a determination to uncover something that no one else could have possibly known to look for. Days passed, and Miss Marple continued to observe. Margaret Crane made no public declarations, nor did she seek to draw attention to herself. Yet, her every move was calculated. She spoke with the vicar, exchanged pleasantries with the townsfolk, and walked the length of the churchyard twice, her steps deliberate, her eyes searching. Her questions about Eliza's final days, so seemingly innocent, began to echo through the whispers of St. Mary Mead. It wasn't long before Mrs. Bantry, ever the gossip, relayed her observations during their afternoon tea. "I do find it curious," Mrs. Bantry remarked, stirring her tea with a touch more enthusiasm than usual. "She seems so interested in what Eliza Crane left behind. More than you'd expect for a niece, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes glinted with understanding. There was something far more significant than family keepsakes at play here. Margaret Crane had not come to mourn her aunt, or to settle old debts. She had come for something hidden, something no one had dared to seek for years. And though Miss Marple had yet to ask the right questions, she knew that the arrival of the letter, coupled with this enigmatic visitor, was no coincidence. The past, it seemed, was not done with St. Mary Mead. It had only just begun to reveal itself, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever watchful, knew it was only a matter of time before the truth, no matter how carefully concealed, came to light. Margaret Crane's arrival in St. Mary Mead had all the hallmarks of a seemingly innocent visit, a niece coming to tend to the affairs of a recently departed aunt. Yet, as the days passed and she lingered in the village, something about her presence began to stir the undercurrents of a past long buried. Her questions were never rushed or overt, but they were meticulous, each one calculated to probe deeper into the corners of Eliza Crane's quiet life. She inquired about her aunt's health, the few friends she may have had, and whether Eliza had found peace in her final years. To the casual observer, it would appear that Margaret was merely seeking to understand her aunt better, perhaps out of affection, or even a touch of nostalgia. But to those more accustomed to the subtle rhythms of small-town life, those who knew when something didn't sit quite right, Margaret's inquiries were disconcerting. There was an air of purpose behind her politeness, an unnerving undertone, that suggested she was searching for something far more elusive than sentimental recollections. Reverend Phelps, a man of sharp insight, was the first to notice the oddity in Margaret's questions. He commented to Miss Marple how her tone had shifted from simple curiosity to something more like cross-examination, as though she was searching for details, not just about Eliza's life, but about something hidden, something long forgotten. Eliza Crane had left behind little of significance, at least to the outside world, just a modest life as a nurse, a quiet death, and no close family to claim her few possessions. Yet, Margaret seemed obsessed with uncovering every trace of her aunt's time in the village, especially the circumstances surrounding her quiet, almost unnoticed passing. What puzzled Miss Marple most, however, was not the questions Margaret asked, but the ones she avoided. In all her careful probing, Margaret had shown no interest in the one place that had defined Eliza's later years, Thistlewood Cottage. This small weathered home, where Eliza had spent her final days, was largely forgotten, much like its occupant. But Margaret's question, whether the cottage had been left untouched, struck Miss Marple as unusual. It was a subtle difference, but in Miss Marple's experience, it was often the small, seemingly insignificant details that held the key to unlocking a mystery. The more Margaret inquired about the past, the more the village began to stir with recollections of Eliza's earlier life, particularly her time at Ravenon Hall. The memory of Sir Miles's son, Peter, a delicate boy who had died under mysterious circumstances, resurfaced, though the details remained murky. Some said Peter's death had been a tragic accident, a fall or a sudden illness, while others hinted at a darker truth. Had there been foul play? Had Eliza known more than she had ever let on? The whispers were fueled by the rumors of a missing will, one that might have changed the course of the inheritance at Ravenon Hall, leaving everything to Peter's mother, rather than his stepmother, Lady Celia. Yet the will had never been found, and Eliza had been dismissed from her position as nurse under strange, unexplained circumstances. There had been no scandal, no accusations, just an inexplicable separation, and with it, the quiet, lingering suspicion that something had been amiss. Margaret's presence had begun to unravel these old wounds, stirring up memories that had faded into the background over time. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, noted how Margaret's quiet persistence seemed to tap into the very heart of these unresolved mysteries. The village, once content in its mundane rhythm, now hummed with a new undercurrent of tension. Margaret's seemingly innocent questions were stirring the pot of history, and as Miss Marple watched, she began to sense that Margaret's visit was no mere family affair. Something far more sinister was at play, a truth hidden beneath layers of time and silence. The tension heightened one evening as Miss Marple, tending to a fading bloom on her niece's memorial plot, happened upon Margaret standing beside a modest headstone in the churchyard. The way Margaret lingered, her gaze fixed on the stone, was telling. It wasn't a moment of quiet reflection or remembrance, but something more calculated. She wasn't simply visiting her aunt's grave. She was waiting perhaps for some sign, perhaps for a revelation. Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that came from years of watching human nature unfold, that Margaret Crane had not come to this village to mourn an aunt. She had come for answers, answers that Eliza Crane had kept buried, answers that for reasons unknown, Margaret was determined to find. And as Miss Marple stood quietly in the shadows, she realized that this was no ordinary visit. The shadows of the past had begun to stir, and the truth, long hidden beneath layers of secrecy and silence, was on the verge of being unearthed. The stage was set for a reckoning that would bring to light the secrets Eliza Crane had kept for so many years, and in the process, reveal a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. Margaret Crane's arrival in St. Mary Me seemed innocent at first, a niece taking care of the affairs of a recently deceased aunt. But something in her demeanor struck Miss Marple as off-kilter. She was too still, too focused, like someone on the brink of uncovering a truth that no one else could see. That evening, Miss Marple found herself at Eliza Crane's grave, ostensibly tending to a pot of violas. Yet, as she bent closer to the stone, she noticed something unsettling, a faintly scratched-out name, hastily erased with the dull stroke of a pencil. It wasn't new, this mark. It had been there for some time, but it was fresh enough to suggest urgency, an impulse to retract a claim, perhaps a connection that hadn't been meant to surface. The soil near the grave had been disturbed, not recently but recently enough to suggest some quiet effort had been made to obscure something. The faint dust of graphite still clung to Margaret's gloves when she passed Miss Marple earlier, a smudge barely noticeable, but it hadn't escaped the older woman's sharp eye. What name had been there, and why had it been removed? It was a trivial action, seemingly childish, even, but in Miss Marple's experience, such small private actions often spoke volumes. They weren't made in the open. For show, they were born of quiet desperation, the kind of act that revealed something hidden beneath the surface. It was a claim made, and then swiftly retracted, a secret hastily buried. As the afternoon sun faded, Margaret passed Miss Marple once more, her eyes meeting the older woman's with a tight, controlled smile, one that betrayed nothing yet hinted at everything. Miss Marple knew then, with a certainty that chilled her, that this was no ordinary visit. It wasn't just a niece mourning an aunt, it was someone searching for answers, answers buried long ago. Later that day, Miss Marple found herself in the warm drawing room of the local vicarage, the fragrance of lavender and bergamot mingling in the air. Tea was poured, and the conversation turned toward Eliza Crane. Reverend Phelps and Dr. Hayward, two men who had known Eliza in her final years, spoke of her with measured care. Reverend Phelps, always careful with his words, described her as a woman who had not invited affection, but had shown a quiet integrity. Hayward, less reserved, recalled the scandal surrounding Peter Raventon's sudden death, a frail boy under Eliza's care, whose passing had sparked whispers of foul play. The death itself had seemed inconsequential, but the aftermath, an eerie shift in the household, an air of tension, was far more troubling. It was a shift that led to the quiet departure of both Peter's mother and Eliza herself. "I recall," Miss Marple said softly, stirring her tea, "that Eliza arrived here without so much as a reference. Rather unusual, don't you think, for someone in her position?" Both men fell silent. It was Dr. Hayward who finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "She was sent away, not dismissed," he remarked, his words carrying the weight of something far more significant. To be sent away was not to be fired, it was to be made to disappear, to vanish quietly without explanation. And such silences, Miss Marple knew, were rarely innocent. The conversation then shifted, and Miss Marple, always with the subtlety of someone used to unpicking the fabric of human nature, found herself visiting Mr. Pettigrew, the local solicitor. His father had once handled affairs for Ravenon Hall, and Miss Marple knew that time, with its slow methodical way of loosening tight-lipped secrets, could open doors previously sealed. She steered the conversation carefully, guiding it toward the long-forgotten matter of lost wills. As Mr. Pettigrew spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts began to gather like storm clouds. The small disturbances, Margaret's actions, the missing name on the grave, the quiet hints of a long-buried scandal, were all beginning to connect. Margaret had not come to St. Mary Mead to mourn an aunt. She had come to uncover something far more sinister. The quiet retraction of a name, the mysterious circumstances of Eliza's departure from Ravenon Hall, and the whispers of a missing will, were all part of a larger puzzle, one that Miss Marple realized had been waiting to be solved for many years. And Margaret, for all her politeness, was determined to unearth it, no matter the cost. Miss Marple stood by the window, her hands folded in front of her, the faint light of the fading day, casting long shadows on her thoughtful face. Her mind, usually a tapestry of calm reasoning, now swirled with unsettling thoughts. It was a puzzle that had begun with an innocent inquiry into a lost document, yet now, the pieces were forming a far more dangerous picture, one that tugged at the very fabric of lives long past. The codicil, once rumored to have been appended to Sir Miles's will, was the first thread that had caught her attention. It had been rumored to ensure that Peter's inheritance, should anything happen to him, would fall to Lady Agatha, his mother. But it had never surfaced. No one had questioned the missing document when the will was read, and Celia, Sir Miles's second wife, had inherited the estate, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. No one had made a fuss. And yet Miss Marple knew all too well that silence often concealed far more than the loudest protests ever could. It was not just the missing codicil that troubled her. It was the context surrounding it. Eliza Crane's quiet dismissal from Ravenon Hall, the death of Peter under mysterious circumstances, and the hasty departure of Peter's mother from the estate. All of these pieces seemed too perfectly timed to be mere coincidences. There had been no outcry, no investigation into what had happened to Eliza, just a deliberate pushing of the past aside, as if it had never existed. But Miss Marple understood that some things don't fade as easily as people might hope. It was only after a conversation with Mr. Pettigrew, the local solicitor, that Miss Marple began to feel the weight of the past settling into a clearer shape. His words, spoken with care and yet tinged with an undercurrent of reluctance, revealed something crucial. A codicil had existed. A document that could have changed everything. Yet it was gone, vanished without a trace. The fact that no one had sought it out in the wake of Peter's death only deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. Someone had wanted to ensure that the inheritance remained untouched by questions. Someone had wanted to make sure that what had been meant for Peter would fall into the hands of another. But who had the power to bury the truth so thoroughly? To suppress what should have been a straightforward matter of inheritance? It seemed that Eliza had known something, or at the very least, had been a part of something that someone else wanted hidden. As she turned these questions over in her mind, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara Beetle, a former nurse who had worked with Eliza at Ravenon Hall. Clara had not been an ordinary woman, and her relationship with Eliza was clouded with whispers and unspoken words. When Miss Marple dug deeper into Clara's past, she found that the nurse had not died alone, but with a mysterious visitor, a woman who claimed to be her niece, though no such relative had ever been recorded. Miss Marple knew this visitor could not be anyone other than Eliza herself, or at the very least, someone tied to her past. And it was this connection, Eliza Clara, the missing codicil, that began to draw a more troubling picture. Clara, a woman who had kept secrets in her silence, had known more than she had ever let on. If anyone knew of the codicil's existence, it was Clara, and she had buried that knowledge, perhaps for fear of the consequences it might have brought. The layers of deception were carefully stacked, and as Miss Marple pieced them together, she realized with growing certainty that this was no longer just a mystery of inheritance. It was a mystery of intent. Eliza Crane had not just been a nurse, she had been a player in a game much darker than anyone had imagined. And as Miss Marple pieced together the final threads, she knew the truth was waiting, hidden beneath years of silence, waiting to be unearthed. The real question was no longer whether the codicil existed, but what it had concealed, and who was determined to keep it buried at all costs. The grand imposing halls of Ravenon were a far cry from the humble nursing home nestled in the forgotten corner of Yorkshire, far removed from the whispers of stately estates or village gossip. Yet within the quiet confines of Woodley House, a final secret had patiently awaited its discovery, lying dormant like an unread letter left in the shadows, and someone had come to retrieve it. The matron's letter was curt, as such responses often were, offering little more than a factual recounting of Clara Beetle's passing just weeks before. Her health had slowly declined, a silent retreat after years of serving with discretion. In her final months, only one visitor had come to see her, a woman who signed in under the name of Margaret Crane. The visit had been brief, the conversation whispered in hushed tones. Afterward, Clara Beetle had seemed unsettled, her calm facade cracking briefly before she slipped back into the silence she had maintained for years. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her brow furrowing with a mix of curiosity and recognition. The name Margaret Crane had been an alias, nothing more than a mask, a name not meant to deceive the institution, but to secure a false connection, a name that once peeled back, would reveal much more than it had ever meant to. Clara Beetle had known something, or at the very least, had held the key to a secret someone was desperately trying to keep hidden. Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that the name Margaret Crane was not just an accident, but a deliberate choice, a connection made by someone who had no other claim to the truth except a need to find it before it slipped away completely. The letter, now folded and placed aside, was accompanied by another, an old yellowing envelope from Ravenon Hall. The two seemed almost to speak to each other, like long-lost companions reuniting to share a tale long untold. There was little doubt in Miss Marple's mind now, that the woman had been none other than Eliza Crane, or perhaps someone closely tied to her, someone who had come looking for answers, but arrived too late, or perhaps not too late at all. The layers of this mystery were thickening, each thread pulling tighter as Miss Marple's mind raced to unravel it. Some secrets, it seemed, were too stubborn to be buried. The truth, when it surfaced, often rushed forward with a ferocity that could not be contained. As Miss Marple rose and grabbed her coat, she knew that the time for questions was drawing to an end. Someone had just run out of time, and with that thought, she stepped into the cold morning, ready to confront the past. At the Elms, Mrs. Cathcart, the watchful landlady, noticed a strange stillness. The room at the end of the hall, where Miss Margaret Crane had quietly taken residence, remained untouched. No request for breakfast, no sounds of movement, just an eerie silence that grew thicker with each passing hour. By mid-morning her concern had overtaken politeness, and the vicar was called, along with the constable. Within an hour the door was forced open, revealing Margaret Crane, still as death itself, lying upon the narrow bed. One hand rested calmly by her side, the other curled over a closed book. Her face, though composed, carried the unmistakable stillness of someone who had not left this world in peace. There was no struggle, no sign of intrusion, only the silent ending of someone who had never come here with good intentions. Dr. Hayward, summoned in haste, conducted his examination with a practiced air, but even he could not hide the unease in his eyes. The woman, once vibrant with secrets, now lay cold, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. Digitalis poisoning, he concluded. A slow and cruel death, masked by the sweetness of tea, the subtle bitterness of fruit preserves. A poison once favored by district nurses, whose hands had once dispensed it with care, knowing well the fine line between treatment and tragedy. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, showed no outward shock. The faint signs that had been ignored by others were now clear to her. The patterns were beginning to form. A death too quiet to be natural, one that echoed too loudly of long-held secrets and unspoken truth. The truth, once delayed, had a way of arriving with borrowed names, and leaving behind far more than just a cold room. The post-mortem confirmed it. Margaret Crane had not died by chance, but by design. The death of this woman, so intricately linked to a web of old lies, had been no accident. And now Miss Marple was certain that this was no mere inheritance mystery. It was the final act of a long-hidden plot, one where the dead had been made to keep their silence. The mist hung thick over St. Mary Mead, a blanket of secrecy that seemed to suffocate the village, as if the past was once again stirring, reluctant but determined. It had been far too long since anyone had even thought to mention Margaret Crane. Her arrival in the village was hardly noticed. A quiet, unassuming presence, just as quickly faded from memory as it had been etched into it. Yet now, everything about her life, the small, seemingly inconsequential details, was unraveling like a tapestry from a forgotten time. The discovery came suddenly, hidden within the depths of her modest room at the local inn. The landlady, Mrs. Cartwright, with her fingers trembling from more than just exhaustion, had unlocked a small trunk that had been tucked away for years. Beneath simple clothes, blouses that had seen better days, shoes worn from use, lay a collection of old documents. These were not the trivialities of a common visitor, but were instead filled with a deeper, more unsettling significance. Old letters, worn with time, signed with a name that was unfamiliar, Marlene Tuckett, amongst Ravenon Hall staff notices, all indicating a connection to a place long past, to a life long buried. But it was the photograph that caused the chill in the air to intensify. Its edges curled, faded by the passage of years, the ink nearly lost to time. But the image it contained spoke volumes. A young nurse, dressed in the uniform of an earlier era, stood beside a sundial, holding a small child in her arms. A simple, innocent picture, one that could have belonged to anyone. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes recognized the garden immediately. It was not the ornate garden of Ravenon Hall, as she had first expected. No, it was a garden from St. Mary Mead itself, the very one near the vicarage, where the sundial had stood for generations. A quiet, unremarkable garden, yet it bore a weight of memories that none in the village had dared to touch. The nurse in the photograph, her face, though altered by time, was strikingly familiar. Miss Marple's mind raced. She had seen that face before, in the distant memories of a woman who had once been part of the fabric of the village, a nurse by the name of Eliza Crane, someone whose history was as tangled and mysterious as the secrets the village held. But it wasn't the nurse's identity that unsettled Miss Marple the most. It was the child whose gaze was solemn and direct, whose features, although blurred by time, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Sir Miles, the late and revered patriarch of Ravenon Hall, a child whose existence had never been formally acknowledged in any record, whose name had never been spoken aloud in the halls of power. Yet there it was, in the form of a photograph, a direct, undeniable link to the legacy of Ravenon Hall. And then the weight of it all fell into place. Marlene Tuckett, the woman who had arrived in St. Mary Me under an assumed name, had not come seeking some long-forgotten piece of her past. No, she had come seeking something far more sinister, a secret buried too deep for comfort. The photograph, tucked away so carefully in her Bible, was not a keepsake. It was not a simple memento of a forgotten time. It was a message, a warning. The child in the photo mattered. They had mattered, even if everyone else had forgotten. The sundial, with its unique inscription, Tempus Fugit, an ancient reminder of the fleeting nature of time, had stood in the vicarage garden long before the war, bearing witness to a history far older and more treacherous than any could have imagined. For Miss Marple, it was no longer about a mere photograph, or a long-forgotten maid's return. It was about legacy, an old legacy, that someone had gone to great lengths to suppress, to bury beneath lies, half-truths, and false identities. The quiet of the village had never been so unnerving, for Miss Marple realized that Marlene's return was not just a chapter of the past revisiting the present. It was a deliberate and well-planned act to uncover what had long been hidden. Someone had known who she truly was, someone had known the secret she carried, and someone had feared what she might say, and so she had been silenced, her life cut short before she could reveal the terrible truth she had unearthed. As Inspector Graves took the reins of the investigation, the pieces began to fall into place, but they were far more complex than anyone had first believed. The connections were tangled in ways they hadn't yet fully comprehended. The sundial, the garden, the child, each was a piece of a puzzle that led to Ravenon Hall, to a legacy more dangerous than anyone had ever dared to acknowledge. With each step, the shadows grew longer, more oppressive, and the quiet whispers of the past threatened to drown the present. The village, so accustomed to its peaceful routine, was waking up to the fact that some secrets, once buried, could never truly stay hidden. The photograph, the final piece of the puzzle, had been hiding in plain sight for years. It was not just a relic of the past, it was a warning. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled as she stood at the edge of the truth, a truth that promised to shatter the calm of St. Mary Me forever. The quiet had been broken, and now the hunt for the person who had silenced Marlene Tuckett would begin in earnest. And Miss Marple, as always, was already several steps ahead, prepared to unravel the final mystery, no matter how dark or dangerous it would prove to be. The atmosphere in St. Mary Me had always been one of calm, but the sudden return of Marlene Tuckett had disrupted that peace in ways no one could have foreseen. Her arrival was far from dramatic. There were no outbursts, no fiery accusations, only a quiet tension that clung to her every step. It was this silence, this absence of action, that made her return so unsettling, for it was an absence that spoke louder than any words could. The village's most respectable figures, each with their own hidden fears, had unknowingly been bound by a secret that until now had remained buried beneath layers of silence and polite conversation. Mrs. Celia Raventon, the widow of Sir Miles, stood first among them. The temptation of inheritance was not something she could ignore. Ravenon Hall, once her husband's domain, had passed to her, but with that power came vulnerability. Marlene's quiet return, an old maid with her elusive history and claims about a child, had the potential to unravel everything. The idea that Marlene might hold knowledge of a child, one who could have a legal right to the estate, sent shivers through the old widow's spine. If such a child existed, it would be more than a mere familial inconvenience. It would destroy Celia's claim to the Ravenon fortune, her place in society, everything she had fought for. Then there was Colonel Barrington, whose relationship to the Raventon family was more driven by ambition than blood. A cousin by name only, he had long resented his exclusion from Sir Miles' will, his bitterness simmering beneath a polite exterior. His closeness to the Raventon solicitors had made him a trusted yet quietly suspicious figure. His resentment had never been aired openly, but it simmered, making him a potential suspect with his own quiet motives. Miss Eloise Green, once a childhood companion of the late Peter Raventon, now lived in seclusion, untouched by time, or so it seemed. But the photograph, the one of Nurse Eliza Crane, had revealed more than her reclusive life had ever allowed. Eloise had never married, never left the village, and her silence had been an enigma. But beneath that silence lay a knowledge, one that carried a quiet fear of the consequences of speaking it aloud. And there was Mr. Pym, the solicitor, who had devoted himself to Sir Miles's affairs with a professionalism that veiled more than a few secrets. Loyalty, some called it. Others, discretion bordering on concealment. His role in handling the estate had always seemed above reproach, but his deep connection to the family and his secrets made him a shadowy figure at the center of it all. Despite their outward civility, all these individuals shared one thing. They were each bound not by their actions but by their omissions. They had stood too close to something dark, too hesitant to speak its name. They were all, in their own way, complicit in a silence that held them hostage. It was with this knowledge that Miss Marple invited them all to her home for a simple tea, a gathering under the guise of paying tribute to Nurse Eliza Crane's years of service. The invitation was carefully worded, crafted to disarm, to let them feel at ease before she gently began to stir the pot. The tea was served, and the conversation meandered in polite civil tones. But Miss Marple was not simply interested in words. She was interested in reactions. She observed Mrs. Raventon's meticulously rehearsed movements, the way she removed her gloves, as if performing a ritual she had long perfected. She noted the slight tension in Colonel Barrington's demeanor, the subtle way he seemed poised to defend himself, even though no accusation had been made. Reverend Phelps, the ever-gracious diplomat, watched more closely than he ever had before, as if searching for something hidden in plain sight. Miss Eloise Green, though pale and composed, took her tea without sugar, and barely touched the seed cake she had once adored. There was no raised voice, no heated discussion. It was all polite, courteous, but under the surface, something simmered. Miss Marple listened carefully, allowing the conversation to drift and unwind. She asked the simplest of questions, about the changes at Ravenon Hall, about old acquaintances and visitors. Yet with each response, she heard more than they realized. The cracks began to show. It was Mrs. Raventon's offhand remark, made with an air of superiority, that caught Miss Marple's attention. "If you mean that dreadful girl Margaret, who came sniffing around after the funeral, then yes, briefly," she said, dismissing the mention of the girl as if she were of no consequence. But in the quiet that followed, in the small barely perceptible shift in the room, Miss Marple knew that the weight of what had been said was far greater than any of them would admit. The truth was not always as loud as it seemed. Sometimes, it was steeped in silence, like tea left to steep far too long, its strength growing in the shadows. Miss Marple's mind turned the pieces over carefully. There were no explosive tempers, no obvious enemies, only a web of omissions, a delicate balance that would be shattered the moment someone dared to speak the truth. Each of them had stood too close to something, too close to a secret that none of them could afford to face. The game had begun, and Miss Marple, as always, was ahead of the others, watching, waiting for the right moment to unravel the threads and expose the darkness that lurked beneath the veneer of civility. The room, though draped in civility, pulsed with a quiet, suffocating tension, one that no amount of carefully crafted politeness could entirely conceal. Miss Marple, her spoon poised in mid-air, did not correct Mrs. Raventon's offhand comment. She didn't need to. The slip had already been made, the truth already laid bare in the smallest, most innocuous of exchanges. Mrs. Raventon had referred to Marlene Tuckett by her real name, an action that should not have been possible, not with the careful veils of secrecy that had surrounded the late woman's true identity. The others, as if bound by an invisible pact, had spoken only in vague terms, never naming the woman directly, never acknowledging the dark shadow she had cast upon their lives. But Celia, with a single word, had broken that silence, revealing an intimate knowledge of Marlene Tuckett that shouldn't have been hers. It was a telling moment, one that could easily be overlooked by anyone less attuned to the subtleties of human nature. But not Miss Marple. No, Miss Marple had learned long ago that guilt did not always announce itself in grand confessions. Sometimes, it crept in through the smallest, most telling moments, through a glance, a misstep, or a quick recollection that had no business being remembered at all. She tucked that moment away in her mind, not as a triumph, but as a quiet recognition of what had been unwittingly revealed. The conversation flowed on, almost too smoothly, and the light, unassuming chatter resumed. But beneath the words, there lingered something darker, something Miss Marple could sense more keenly than anyone else in the room. Colonel Barrington, ever the charming guest, had been too smooth in his manner, too polished in his delivery, his stories too carefully chosen. He steered the conversation away from the relevant details of Nurse Crane's life, choosing instead to dwell on irrelevant tales of wartime correspondence, stories that felt more like distractions than recollections. But it was in one of these meandering narratives that he made an unexpected slip, a line from a letter, quoted verbatim, with the kind of precision that suggested a prior familiarity. "Though we may never speak again, what we shared must not be undone," he had said, the words flowing from his lips with an eerie comfort. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. That phrase, that very line, was one she had seen before. It had been in a letter, one among Marlene Tuckett's belongings, believed to have been written by Nurse Eliza Crane, to a woman named Clara Beetle. It was a letter that had never left the hands of Inspector Graves, a letter that had never been shared with anyone outside of the investigation. Yet here was Colonel Barrington, quoting it as if it was something he had read long ago, long before Marlene's death. The familiarity with those words struck Miss Marple like a cold gust of wind. Had he seen the letter himself? Had he read it before it had even made its way into the hands of the authorities? The question hung in the air, heavy and unsettling, as the conversation continued around her. Then, as if to further cement the colonel's discomfort, Miss Marple watched as his hand drifted toward the sugar bowl, not for his own tea, which he always drank black, but to absently pocket a sugar cube. It was a trivial gesture, one easily dismissed as mere absent-mindedness, but Miss Marple had long since learned to read between the lines of human behavior. People rarely stole sugar without reason. More often than not, such actions betrayed a hidden bitterness, a desire to conceal something unpleasant. And in his trembling fingers, Miss Marple saw not just the subtle tremor of age, but the calculated touch of someone who had learned to measure risks, to weigh consequences, and who perhaps for the first time in a long while, was beginning to question his own certainty. It was then, during a rare lull in the conversation, that Miss Marple casually remarked on the state of the vicarage garden. The old sundial, she noted, still leaned a touch westward, defying time itself in its steady tilt. At that, Miss Eloise Green, who had up until then been a quiet observer, showed the first real sign of tension. Her fingers tightened on the rim of her teacup, her eyes flickering not toward Miss Marple, but toward Mrs. Raventon, as if seeking a silent cue, or fearing the potential fallout of the remark. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. No one else in the room seemed to notice the shift, but Miss Marple did. She had seen such things before, small, almost imperceptible reactions that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. Miss Green said nothing, of course. She excused herself with a quiet, well-practiced apology, and left the gathering sooner than expected. It was not a dramatic exit. It was a calculated one. No one asked after her early departure, nor did anyone remark on her sudden discomfort. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen the signs. The conversation drifted aimlessly on, but the undercurrents of tension remained. The reactions of the guests, the subtle shifts in their behavior, the stolen moments of self-betrayal, all of these pieces were silently falling into place. And as Miss Marple sipped her tea, she quietly tucked the memory of Miss Green's discomfort, the quote from the Colonel's slip, and the disturbing familiarity with the letter into her mental puzzle. She had long since learned that the key to solving the deepest mysteries lay not in grand revelations, but in these quiet, delicate moments, the reactions that no one else saw, but which told the truth all the same. Each one was another clue in a case that was slowly beginning to unravel, one subtle thread at a time. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unassuming grace, was the only one who could see the full picture. The room, though draped in civility, carried with it an undeniable undercurrent of something far darker. Miss Marple, seated gracefully at the edge of her chair, observed the departures of her guests with the practiced indifference of one who had long since learned how to read the unsaid. The door closed behind Colonel Barrington, his stiff retreat accompanied by the faintest sigh of relief from the others. She rose without a word, moving with the quiet certainty of someone whose every action had purpose, whose every gesture was laden with meaning. The cups and saucers were cleared, stacked with careful precision, each napkin folded with an expert's touch. As she wiped down the table, she noted, as always, which plate had gone untouched, and which had been wiped clean. There was a language in such things, an unspoken confession in every crumb, a subtle revelation in every hesitation. But it wasn't the plates that drew her attention now. It was the spoon. As she rinsed the teaspoons in the sink, one caught her eye, an anomaly, small yet significant. It wasn't just that it was out of place, though it certainly didn't belong. It wasn't merely that it had been left behind. No, it was the faint trace it carried, an unusual residue, a milky film that clung to the inside of the bowl. She paused, her fingers hovering over the water, her mind flashing back to years past, years when nurses desperate to save lives dissolved digitalis in tea for cardiac patients. The powder, if not properly stirred, left behind a signature of sorts, a bitter, invisible fingerprint that lingered like a secret. This spoon was different. Its handle was lighter, its pattern slightly askew. Miss Marple had laid out 6 matching spoons that morning. This made 7. The extra spoon hadn't been left by accident. It had been placed there deliberately. Someone had used it. The residue, still clinging to the surface, whispered of something hidden, something deliberately obscured. Miss Marple dried the spoon carefully, wrapping it in a linen cloth, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, where the evidence would remain undisturbed. Not all clues shouted. Some spoke in whispers, and it was in these whispers that the truth often hid. The next morning, with the same quiet grace, Miss Marple made her way to Woodley House. She didn't come bearing accusations or confrontations, just the quiet persistence of a woman who knew how to ask the right questions. The matron, a brisk woman with an air of authority, greeted her with measured respect. Miss Marple listened intently as the matron spoke of Clara Beetle, an enigmatic woman who had in her final days remained oddly distant, as if something had unsettled her. The last visitor to see her had been a woman dressed in a sharp professional manner, a woman who had claimed to be Clara's niece. She had signed the visitor's log as Margaret Crane, and stayed for no more than an hour. The matron recalled that afterward, Clara had asked for water, and for the rest of the day, she remained unusually quiet, her demeanor somber. That evening, she had wept without explanation. The next morning, Clara's condition worsened rapidly. Miss Marple, ever the observant listener, thanked the matron and left, but her thoughts were already spinning, already 3 steps ahead. The name Margaret Crane lingered in her mind, its significance clear now, as it had been all along. Margaret Crane was of course an alias, Marlene Tuckett in disguise. The woman had not come to Clara for comfort, but for something far more urgent, a truth perhaps, or evidence of a truth long buried. The photograph that had been so carefully preserved now took on new meaning in Miss Marple's mind. It wasn't the sundial in the background that mattered, but the child in the foreground. There had been something unnervingly deliberate about that image, something too precious in its preservation. It had been a message that Clara, with her unyielding loyalty, had likely understood. As Miss Marple's mind continued to sift through the puzzle, she turned once more to Reverend Phelps. The visit wasn't a formal interrogation. It was simply a suggestion over tea, an invitation to revisit the old parish records, particularly those entries that had never made it into the official log, but had been jotted down in the margins of the vicar's private journal. Reverend Phelps had agreed readily, his discretion as admirable as ever. That afternoon, he returned with a worn folio, its pages yellowed with age. Among the faded ink, he had found something curious, an entry that Miss Marple had suspected all along. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but in it lay the key to a mystery that was slowly unraveling, one layer at a time. As she turned the pages, Miss Marple's mind raced. She knew the game was afoot. The pieces were falling into place, one by one, and she could already sense the final inevitable revelation. Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit room, her eyes tracing the faded edges of an old brittle photograph. A faint echo of something long buried whispered through her thoughts, unsettling yet revealing the faintest glimmer of truth. She had never believed in coincidences, and this photograph, half forgotten in the back of an old ledger, was no exception. As she sifted through the loose papers, an old document caught her attention. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eliza M. Crane. The name brought with it a rush of memories, the kind that always seemed to carry an undercurrent of guilt and unsaid words. In the careful looping script, Eliza had chronicled a life she had hoped to bury, detailing the birth of a child in secret, his identity hidden, his future obscured by the very mother who had brought him into the world. Miss Marple's heart tightened as she read the final words. Truth once buried will rise, a quiet confession wrapped in an air of solemn inevitability. The child, though not named in official records, was unmistakably linked to a man of power, a legacy of hidden shame. His existence had been erased, not for lack of care, but for fear of the ruin his bloodline could bring. And then there was Marlene Tuckett, a woman driven not by sentiment, but by necessity. Her return to these memories, not for closure, but for leverage. She had unearthed the truth and, like a shadow, had quietly taken her place in the tale of Eliza's son. But as Miss Marple pieced the puzzle together, something more unsettling lingered in the air. What had Marlene truly wanted? Was she seeking redemption, or was she after something darker, something that could alter the very course of history? As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple could not help but feel that something far more dangerous than a simple inheritance was at stake. The thread of fear, not malice, wove through the women's lives. Fear of being exposed, the spoon, the evidence of something far more insidious than a casual conversation over tea, now seemed to speak louder than words. A silent confession to a crime born not from hatred, but from the desperate need to preserve what little was left of a fractured life. And with that, Miss Marple knew it was time to confront the final elusive truth, the one no one dared to speak aloud, but everyone feared to acknowledge. The truth that had been carefully hidden in the folds of time, now ready to break free, and with it, the final unraveling of the mystery that had haunted them all. Miss Marple remained still, her poised presence, quiet yet undeniably commanding as the tension in the drawing room thickened. The guests, summoned under the most subtle of pressures, had arrived without resistance, each bearing the unmistakable weight of uncertainty. They filed in one by one, their steps measured, as if they knew they were no longer the masters of their own narrative. Celia Raventon entered first, her demeanor calm yet strained, the delicate facade she wore betraying the sharpness of her internal unease. Every movement was controlled, but the veil of composure seemed increasingly fragile with each passing moment. Colonel Barrington, usually so self-assured, followed, a slight disarray in his usual impeccable manner, his posture a little more rigid than usual, his eyes darting to the others. Miss Eloise Green entered next, her movements deliberate but stiff, the discomfort radiating from her in subtle waves, her eyes cast downward as if the room itself was too heavy to bear. Pym, the solicitor, trailed behind them, his face carefully neutral but his knuckles pale against the briefcase he gripped. His every step betrayed the hope that perhaps, despite the growing dread, the unpleasantness of the moment might somehow bypass him. The drawing room, selected for its unassuming elegance, held the weight of the past, and as Reverend Phelps served tea, no one dared touch it. The ritual of politeness seemed almost ludicrous in the face of what was unfolding. Miss Marple sat among them, unmoving, a figure of quiet authority. She did not need to rise, to make her presence known in any way. Her stillness spoke louder than any word could. She had been a quiet observer for so long, but now, the moment had arrived for her to gently guide them through the inevitable unraveling of secrets they had so carefully guarded. She began, her tone not accusatory but calm, as though recounting something that had long since been settled in her mind. Her words were precise, each one falling like a stone in a pond, sending ripples through the room that would not cease. The photograph she spoke of was not a mere memento of the past, nor a sentimental relic. It was a piece of damning evidence, a testament to a life erased and hidden, a child, born to Eliza Crane, whose very existence had been carefully wiped away. And this child, Miss Marple explained, was not some orphan or incidental ward, but the son of Eliza Crane, born soon after the death of Peter Raventon. There had been another will, drafted with the quiet authority of the people in that very room, a will that included provision for the unnamed son of Eliza Crane. That son had been entrusted to Clara Beetle's care, his existence known only to a select few, and his support hidden away should the truth ever be uncovered. The room shifted. Celia's posture remained immaculate, but Miss Marple could see the slight tightening of her shoulders, a subtle shift that betrayed the weight of her guilt. Colonel Barrington's face, once placid, now betrayed a flicker of recognition.
Mr.
Pym's fingers, so delicately wrapped around his briefcase, tightened involuntarily. There was no escape from the revelation. The codicil, the will that should have solidified the child's rightful place in the legacy of the Raventon estate, had never been filed. It had been drafted, witnessed, and sealed, but someone in this very room, had seen to its quiet disappearance. Miss Marple allowed the weight of that silence to settle over them, watching as it sank in. It wasn't fear of law that had driven this action, but the sharper, more insidious fear of exposure, of a legacy undone by a scandal long buried. The law had not failed them. The intentions of the powerful had simply been intercepted. As she turned her gaze back to Celia Raventon, Miss Marple could see the tightness in her expression now. It was not the grief of a woman mourning her husband, nor the outrage of a widow who had been wronged, but something colder, something more calculating. Celia had not simply allowed the scandal to remain hidden. She had actively buried it, ensured it would never surface, and she had done so with a full understanding of what would happen if the truth was ever made known. There was no shame in her face now, only a careful, deliberate composure, as though every detail had been meticulously managed to ensure the protection of a reputation far more precious than any relationship. This was not a matter of law, Miss Marple knew, but of something far more primal: reputation, legacy, and the lengths people would go to protect them. The truth, now laid bare before them, was something they could not ignore. It was not a mistake or a twist of fate. It was the result of years of carefully placed decisions, of calculated moves made in the shadows, to preserve a reputation at all costs. Miss Marple knew, as she always had, that truth had a way of revealing itself, often when it was least expected. And in this quiet room, where secrets had been buried with such precision, the final reckoning was inevitable. Each of the guests understood this now. There was no more running from the past. The truth had found them, and it would not be denied. Miss Marple sat back, her role no longer that of the observer, but the quiet orchestrator, and watched as they absorbed the revelation, as the weight of their own actions settled over them like a shroud. The truth, so carefully concealed for so long, was now exposed, and the consequences would be theirs to bear, silently, in the same way that Miss Marple had always understood the quiet power of a well-kept secret. The past, no matter how buried, would always rise to the surface, demanding its moment of reckoning. The child, once vanishing into the depths of forgotten memory, had been lost to time. But Miss Marple knew better. Memory, like a shadow, has a way of creeping back into the room when it's least expected, when it's most inconvenient. There are murders, Miss Marple mused, which are born of passion, wild, impulsive, chaotic. But the one before them now was different. It had begun far earlier than the moment poison was stirred, in the silence that had woven itself around a life quietly destroyed. Nurse Eliza Crane, once a woman of impeccable principle and expertise, had been dismissed, not with accusations or charges, but with the shadow of suspicion hanging heavy in the air. Her departure had been quiet, orchestrated with surgical precision, her loyalty punished, her dignity dissipating into the fog of unspoken scandal. She carried the weight of another's shame, shoulders burdened, with no defense to offer. This, Miss Marple explained, was the first murder, the murder of reputation. Years later, Marlene Tuckett had stumbled upon the truth, not by chance, but perhaps by relentless pursuit, or fate's cruel design. She had not shouted it from the rooftops, nor demanded the inheritance to which she was entitled. Instead, she had come quietly, proof in hand, seeking acknowledgement, or perhaps some form of redress. But there were those who saw in her a threat, not merely to wealth, but to legacy, to a name and identity so carefully constructed. And so the second murder had been carried out, not with violence, but with chilling precision, a drop of digitalis in a cup of tea, a single spoon not meant for stirring. Miss Marple's voice remained calm as she laid out the pieces, never raising her tone, never pointing fingers. Her gaze shifted to Celia Ravenon, whose stillness had become unnerving, absolute. Miss Marple knew there were those who would sacrifice anything to maintain an illusion of control, and when the truth itself was more terrifying than any crime, even a simple cup of tea could be turned into a weapon. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the vicar's mantel clock, and the rustling of Colonel Barrington's coat, as he shifted uncomfortably. Inspector Graves remained still, arms folded, his silence acknowledging the weight of the moment. Mrs. Celia Ravenon sat motionless, her once regal composure now fractured, her elegant hands trembling just slightly, as her gaze lingered on the empty teacup before her, the untouched sugar cube resting on its saucer. Finally she spoke, her voice stripped of resistance, flat yet undeniably clear. "Yes," she said, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. No drama, no excuses, just resignation. "I gave her the tea." Her admission was void of justification, the calmness in her voice belying the storm that had ravaged her soul. "I had to," she continued, her eyes fixed on the cup. "She came to destroy everything. For what? Some nurse's child? Some forgotten piece of the past that Sir Miles could never bring himself to name." Miss Marple remained silent, watching as Celia's jaw tightened in an almost imperceptible movement, her breath unsteady. "You don't understand," Celia whispered, her voice cracking with a barely restrained edge. "I saved everything he built. I bore the shame, the whispers he cast on me. I fought for everything, everything he gave me. I fought to keep, and I was supposed to watch it all pass to the daughter of a servant?" She inhaled sharply, trying to steady her voice. "She had the papers, the truth, she knew what it meant, and I couldn't let it happen. Not quietly, not politely. No, I had to undo it all. Everything." No one spoke. Even Inspector Graves stood silent, his presence commanding no more attention than the shadows creeping into the corners of the room. Celia's confession had not been a plea. It had been a declaration, a final harsh pronouncement from a woman who had controlled for so long, only to find that control had consumed her entirely. Silence lingered, oppressive, suffocating. The tension in the room thickened. As Miss Green stared into her lap, Colonel Barrington's gaze locked onto the hearth, unwilling to meet the weight of the moment head-on. No one dared to interrupt the quiet, the gravity pressing on each of them, as if the air had solidified into something dense, heavy, and unmovable. Celia Ravenon, her chin lifted in defiance, sat still, her posture once more elegant, regal even, though her voice now trembled at its edges. Her confession had cost her more than the truth. It had shattered the very image she had so carefully curated for years. "It wasn't about money," she murmured, her voice low, almost defeated. "Not entirely. It was the look in that girl's eyes. She didn't pity me." She paused, the words hanging in the air like a final breath. "She judged me. She thought she was better than me." In the quiet parlor, a sense of unease simmered beneath the surface as Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Celia Raventon, her composed demeanor now cracking at the edges. The air, thick with tension, seemed to press down upon them all, as though time itself had paused in anticipation of the confession that was about to unfold. It was not the violent, dramatic murder that had seized the minds of those present, but a far more insidious crime, one that had been born not from rage or passion, but from cold calculation, a motive that had festered and grown in the shadows of long-buried shame. Celia's gloved hands, once immaculate, now trembled faintly as her eyes drifted to the empty teacup before her, the untouched sugar cube betraying the stillness of the moment. She had plotted with precision, her silent revenge not for the loss of wealth, but for the threat of truth, a truth she could not bear to face, a truth that would undo everything she had spent a lifetime building. As she spoke, her voice betrayed none of the fire one might expect, only a resigned whisper, a quiet acceptance of her own unraveling. "I gave her the tea," she said, the words falling flat, carrying the weight of an irreversible act. There was no remorse, no regret, only the lingering shadow of a woman who had sacrificed her own humanity in the name of preservation, not just of money, but of a legacy, of an image of untouchable virtue. Miss Marple listened, her expression unreadable, yet inwardly she understood the true nature of the crime. It was not about the child, nor even the inheritance, but about the desperate need to maintain control, to silence the truths that threatened to destroy everything Celia had so carefully constructed. The room remained heavy with silence, broken only by the faint rustling of Colonel Barrington's discomfort and the distant ticking of a clock, marking the end of a long dark chapter. In that moment, as Celia's confession hung in the air, Miss Marple realized the real puzzle had always been the human heart, its capacity for deception, for self-preservation, for the quiet murders committed not with poison, but with pride, fear, and the suffocating grip of shame. The garden outside, once a symbol of renewal, now felt like a distant echo of life itself, a reminder that some truths, no matter how well hidden, will always find their way to the surface, no matter how much time and effort it takes to bury them. As Miss Marple moved through the garden, the delicate irises beginning to push through the earth, a child's innocent question pierced the stillness, breaking the tension that had built up around them. "You're the lady who solves puzzles?" she had asked, her gaze clear and untainted by the adult complexities that so often clouded the truth. Miss Marple had simply smiled, her words offering no comfort, no final answer, only the acknowledgement that some mysteries were meant to be endured, others merely survived. And in the fading light of day, as she reflected on the lives that had been caught in this web of secrets and lies, she knew that the greatest puzzles of all were the ones that would never be fully solved, not because the pieces were missing, but because the truth they revealed was too terrible to face. Beneath the surface of society's most polished facades, there had been a quiet unraveling, a slow, almost imperceptible theft of a woman's identity, her dignity stripped away not by scandal or accusation, but by a much more subtle, insidious force. Eliza Crane had not been broken by the sharp sting of a public disgrace. No, the true crime against her had been far colder, more deliberate. She had been suffocated by the quiet cruelty of indifference, by the polite, almost genteel disregard of those around her. It wasn't the venom in the poison that had consumed her, but the years of silence that followed, those long stretches of polite disinterest that had left no visible wounds, only an absence, an emptiness that consumed her from the inside out. The greatest theft of all, Miss Marple knew, was not one that left a trail of blood or bruises, but one that took something far more fragile, the essence of a woman's very self. Dignity, once stolen, rarely finds its way back, not through force or confrontation, but through something far gentler, more elusive, through understanding. As Miss Marple moved slowly through the garden, the faint scent of roses hung in the air, a delicate reminder of the life that could have been, of the stories whispered between the petals of forgotten blooms. She had always known that the true crime wasn't in the act itself, but in what came after, the years of silence that ensued. It was not the poison that had undone Eliza, but the quiet disregard, the whispers of judgment that had followed her wherever she went, leaving her name to fade in the shadows, as though it had never mattered at all. It wasn't the absence of justice that wounded Eliza. It was the absence of being seen, of being truly understood. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the crime that could not be easily fixed. Memory, though, had a strange way of surviving even the cruelest of silences. It lingered, like the faintest traces of a fragrance long forgotten, in the corners of rooms and the edges of minds. A photograph, yellowed with age, a teacup now gathering dust in a forgotten cupboard, a name once written in ink, now only a fading trace, almost gone. These small things, forgotten by most, held the key to the puzzle that had never truly been solved. It was not the law that would bring Eliza's story to light, Miss Marple knew. It was the quiet persistence of those who noticed the things others overlooked, the small details, the forgotten objects, the fragments of a life that had once meant so much. And as Miss Marple bent to examine the delicate rose petals beneath her fingertips, she murmured softly to herself, recalling a story she had once heard. A nurse once saved a child's life, and in doing so lost her own. Her voice, barely a whisper, carried the weight of an unspoken question. Was that the truer crime? She asked the evening air, though no one but the dusk itself was there to answer. She did not expect an answer. She already knew. The true crime had never been the murder or the poison. It had been the silence, the years of polite neglect, the way society had allowed the quiet cruelty of their inaction to continue. And yet in the end, it was not vengeance that brought justice, but memory, the quiet recollection of a life that had been overshadowed, hidden away by time and circumstance. Miss Marple, with her knowing gaze and her patience, had unraveled the truth not through force, but through understanding, through listening to the small things. She had understood that sometimes, it was not the loudest or most obvious truths that mattered. It was the quiet persistence of memory that revealed what had been lost. As she continued to walk among the fading blooms, her thoughts turned to Eliza Crane, no longer a figure of scandal or scandalous mystery, but a woman who had once chosen discretion over defiance, who had loved quietly and endured the harshest of circumstances with grace. It was not the murder, nor even the cover-up, that lingered in Miss Marple's reflections, but the slow, inexorable erosion of a woman's sense of self, piece by piece, day by day, until nothing but the emptiness of silence remained. Some truths, she thought, are not hidden out of malice, but because they are simply too inconvenient to face. The photograph of Eliza, the spoon, the simple objects that had once been part of her life, these were the things that held the story, the puzzle that needed to be solved. Eliza Crane had never sought justice for herself. She had endured the slow erosion of her life, never once crying out for the world to see her pain. Yet through the quiet attentiveness of those who had cared enough to notice the small details, the things that others had overlooked, her story was finally told. It wasn't the law that revealed the truth. It was human memory, the persistence of those who, like Miss Marple, refused to let the story fade. The garden, now bathed in the soft glow of the evening, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple pondered this truth. Some mysteries, she mused, were not meant to be solved by force or reason, but by the patient, quiet unfolding of time. In that moment, Miss Marple knew that the hardest puzzles weren't those with missing pieces. They were the ones where the pieces had been deliberately hidden, left unspoken, buried beneath layers of silence and fear. And sometimes, those puzzles, the ones that never quite fit together, were the most difficult to solve. Would you have confronted Celia earlier? Miss Marple wondered. Or would you have let the mystery bloom in its own time? Would you have revealed the secrets too soon? Or waited for the puzzle to unfold, piece by piece, as it always does? And what of the child in the photograph? What became of them? Was their story forever lost? Or was there still a chance for their voice to be heard? Miss Marple could only wonder. Some stories, after all, were never truly over, but continued to live on in the memories of those who cared enough to notice the small things. And perhaps that, Miss Marple thought, was the most profound mystery of all.